New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring precognition, retrocausality, and the unconscious. With me is Dr. Eric Wargo, who is an anthropologist. He is the author of a highly acclaimed recent book called Time Loops, and he also, for many years, has authored a blog called The Night Shirt. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll be switching over to that channel. Welcome, Eric. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've heard wonderful things about your book, and I think our viewing audience will be very interested in learning about your approach to the field of precognition and retrocausality. You focus on the concept of the time loop. And I think it may be a good way to begin our discussion is just to define what you mean by time loop.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. It's awesome. Really exciting to be here on your show. Yes, a time loop. Well, a time loop is, another way of putting it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, that's colloquially we talk about self-fulfilling prophecies, but we aren't usually using the term prophecy literally. But the idea, and this is also has an analog in physics of the closed time-like curve is what they call it in physics speak, is that events in the future can not only influence the past, but that, in fact, inevitably, that past thing, whatever is influenced in the past, must then contribute to the event in the future, which had the influence on the past. So you're really talking about a causally circular structure. Now, the really interesting thing, and I think one of the reasons that people have failed to take things like precognition very seriously over the years is that they think that that's a paradox somehow. People confuse a tautology, which is a causally circular, structure, with a paradox, which is the idea of something that prevents itself. So you have the grandfather paradox, of course, which is where you have a time traveler going back into the past and killing his grandfather, and so then he can't be born, and then he can't go back in the past, and so forth. So that's paradoxical. But there's nothing paradoxical about an event in the future influencing the past in such a way that that future event then happens. So that's the distinction, and I can give some really good examples of this if you want. Maybe we'll get into that later in the interview.
One of the physicists that you quote when he talks about time loops says it's possible that an event, if it can go back into the past, it can create itself. An event can create itself. That is possible, and as far as you're concerned, it's not a logical paradox.
Right. It's an inevitability, actually. If you're talking, if your cosmology is what sometimes called a block universe, where the future is fixed just as the past is fixed, and it's all sort of all there already. If that's the case, then in fact that circular structure has to be inevitable. And if and what I'm arguing is that if it's possible, it may actually be, in fact, just the way things are. I mean, the universe might be built of time loops in a sense, or of these causally circular structures. And what excites me is that that human psychology, that it might be basic to our psychology, in fact, our biographies, that we're living in these loops constantly, and we're just not aware of it. And so phenomena like precognitive dreams or other sort of premonitions or whatever, they're giving us a little bit of evidence of this, but that really it may go a lot deeper. It may be much more pervasive in our lives.
I'd like to take a deep dive with you into that, because it reminds me of something one of my mentors, the cosmologist Arthur M. Young, once asked me this question. He said, "What is the virgin birth?" And
right.
He explained to me that the virgin birth meant that the individual being born is giving birth to themselves, essentially. And you seem to be suggesting that possibly that explains the Big Bang, the singularity, the idea that the universe gave birth to itself.
Exactly. I mean, that's where this leads. That's where this idea goes. Now, I don't pretend to be a cosmologist, not a physicist. What I'm able to study and examine is how this plays out in our lives. And this, the idea you're talking about, the virgin birth, or another version of it is creation ex nihilo, right? Creation from nothing. That idea could be the basis for creativity, for inspiration. And this is what I'm working on now, actually, in sort of a follow-up to my book, Time Loops. I'm working on sort of the implications of time loops in the field of culture and writing and literature, film. I've got just many, many, many examples. I mean, you can see I packed a lot into the book of examples of writers who, had precognitive experiences and they were drawing on their own futures when they were creating their works. This is pervasive. The more you look at the biographies of artists, the more you find examples of this. And it's funny, the universal experience of artists of any kind, writers, whatever, is that their best ideas just come from nowhere. They don't feel like something we did. They feel like, uncreated. They feel like some creation ex nihilo, really. Well, if an artist is really drawing on future experiences, and that's the source of creativity, that really is creation ex nihilo. And a physicist named David Deutsch, in the early 1990s, I believe, he wrote a paper where he was sort of examining this problem and what the implications of retrocausation in physics might be, or time travel in physics. And he came up with this what he called a paradox, but again, it's not a paradox, of the unproved theorem. And the way it works is this. You have an elderly mathematician who won the Nobel Prize for solving this really difficult math problem. And he goes back in time, in a time machine, to meet his younger self. He finds his younger self struggling in the library, with this math, problem. And he says, well, I'll just help you out. And he shows him the book. And so that his book from the future becomes, the source of the solution, or to the theorem, or the proof of the theorem. Well, and there's a lot of science fiction stories that sort of have that structure to them. And in fact, it comes up in the movie Arrival, which we could talk about if you want. But what really bugged David Deutsch about this is that there's nowhere in that loop where anyone actually does the work of solving the theorem. If you think about it, it's already published. He reads it in the book, and that's how he solves it. But no one actually at no point in that circuit does he actually do the work. And what it really boils down, what really bugs or nags people, I think, about this is this kind of labor theory of of the value of ideas, really, that if you can't show someone doing the work of putting together some new idea, then, we can't abide that. But, honestly, we now know that physics, on the fundamental level, the vacuum is really particles being created out of nothing. So we really can't impose our values, our sort of our Protestant ethic, our Protestant work ethic. We can't impose that on the physical universe, and we maybe can't impose that on our understanding of creativity and human innovation. So it's a really exciting implication, and it's certainly not something that I was thinking about when I started studying precognition several years ago. But it's a really exciting implication, I think, of this idea. It really makes us gods, right? I mean, that we're creating from nothing.
It does, I suppose, make us gods, although I guess you could say that the creativity process is inherent in the universe itself.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So you begin your study by really looking at case histories of particular examples of precognition. And one of the things that I have to give you credit for is you don't dismiss the skeptics. You try to bring into your discussion every skeptical argument that you can think of.
Yeah, I'm really trying to change people's minds here, and you're not going to change people's minds by just giving a lot of examples of things that are just going to seem crazy to a lot of people who are not acquainted with these ideas. Now, I guess when I was writing the book, I sort of had a fantasy that I might change some minds, among the skeptics. I don't think that's probably going to happen. A lot of skeptics have their minds pretty much fixed, but I guess I'm trying to address a scientifically literate, open-minded audience that can understand the argument, can look at the evidence, and make their own conclusions. And one of my arguments is that scientific evidence, no matter how strong, alone is not going to cut it. You can show people overwhelming evidence from parapsychology experiments, and the evidence as well as better than I do probably. I mean, it's really overwhelming. I mean, it's really strong, especially for precognition. The most outrageous, seemingly outrageous psi modality is somehow being influenced by events in the future, and yet the evidence is abundant and really powerful. And but you're just not going to convince people if they're not open to it. But what I think really makes a stronger case is starting to admit that anecdotal evidence, the stories from the individual lives, because it's one thing to tell the story of your precognitive dream and out of context, and people can easily say, well, it's a law of large numbers. Or whatever. It's not so easy to dismiss those individual anecdotes when you do have that bulk of scientific evidence. And then on the other hand, the scientific evidence starts to become a bit clearer or make a little bit more sense when you look at it in light of all those anecdotes. I mean, when you start to realize that those anecdotes are really very consistent from person to person, across cultures, there are some real commonalities to these kinds of experiences that just the sum total of that is just an incredibly strong case for the existence of precognition. And I'm using that term. I'm probably I know some other researchers in this field would dispute my use of the term. I'm using it as just sort of a catch-all for this being influenced by the future in whatever way.
Mm-hmm. In other words, you're lumping together what we call presentiment with retrocausation and precognition.
Right. Well, retrocausation is sort of the physical principle that allows this. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the what in a physics experiment they would call retrocausation because they're not dealing with minds, sort of detecting future events and so forth. So retrocausation is kind of the underlying physical principle. Mm-hmm. But the term precognition, I'm using it to subsume presentiment, premonitions, prophecy, and various other kind of related phenomena that don't have real technical names in the literature. One of my favorites is the writer J.B. Priestley, who collected, I think 1,500 letters of sort of precognitive experiences at one point in the mid-'60s. In Britain, and he sort of, there were a lot of dreams, very typical kind of dream kind of experiences, but a lot of them just didn't fit into that rubric. And what he called them was the future influencing present effect. So, the future somehow influences the present, and we don't need to specify that it's in a dream. We don't need to specify that it's somehow negative, like a premonition. It just sort of is it's a good kind of catch-all term, but precognition is less of a mouthful. So.
Yeah, Priestley wrote a series of plays, as I recall, right, exploring different theories about time, whether time is circular or whether time is linear. He had different scenarios for exploring them in a dramatic context. I think one of the real pioneers in our understanding of precognition, and you write about him extensively, is Dunne.
Right, yes.
J.W. Dunne.
Absolutely, and I think he is the great pioneer in this, and I think that he not only provided a lot of compelling examples from his own life, but he had this wonderful way of thinking about the problem very carefully, and I sort of describe him as a kind of forensic thinker. I mean, because he was literally not only was he designing airplanes in the first decades of the last century, but he was he'd have to study how they crashed, and he could tell exactly what happened at what point in time and sort of piece together an event like a plane crash. Well, he brought that same very careful mentality to studying his precognitive dreams, and he was able to discover something that is very key, which is that he was not, in his dreams, he was not seeing events in the future. He was not seeing a disaster happening far away. He was seeing himself learning of that disaster. He was getting a preview of the way he engaged with that piece of news. And that's a crucial distinction, and it's still not made enough, I don't believe, in parapsychology. Really, the study of precognition really needs to focus on that personal experience, because he was able to tell, and the way you can tell that, the way that you can tell the difference is when there's a discrepancy, right, between the actual event as it happened, as a God's eye video recorder might capture it, and the way that it's reported, or the way he learned the news. So the famous example is the eruption of Mont Pelée in the Caribbean, and he was camped out with his regiment in South Africa, has a dream that he's on this mountain that's about to blow, and that 4,000 people are about to die. And the number 4,000 keeps repeating. So a couple days later, the next batch of mail arrives in the camp, and he reads the headline in a newspaper that 40,000 people are dead on the island of Martinique from the explosion of this volcano.
And what year was that, incidentally?
I believe it was 1900 or 1902. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. It's one of them, 1901. Yeah. It was right around the turn of the century. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, the actual death toll was something like 36,000. There was no 4 in there. It wasn't 4 and a bunch of zeros.
Right. So this would be an example of a dream distortion.
Right.
Because he's keeping track of his dreams. That's basically his study.
Yeah, exactly. But it really wouldn't be a dream distortion. I mean, Freud would call it that. Freud didn't believe in precognitive dreams at all. But really, it wasn't a distortion if he was dreaming about that headline, because the headline was 40,000. You can, a zero here and there. We have trouble when there's more than a few zeros. But the point is, it was 4 and a bunch of zeros. Mm-hmm. That's.
It would be, in other words, it would be a dream distortion, except for the fact that you're looking at a newspaper headline that he might have read in the future, right. That had the number 40,000, which right. is similar to 4,000. The actual death toll didn't have the number 4 in it at all. It was like 36,000, but they rounded up.
Right.
In the headline. So what you're saying is the dream, based on this famous example, the dream may have been precipitated by Dunne himself reading a newspaper headline at some point in the future. That, in other words, that you're saying that precognitions are based on our future mental state.
Right. It's the brain interacting with itself across time. Mm-hmm. Is what I'm arguing, mm-hmm. and a lot of there's abundant evidence for that. It makes a lot of sense of a lot of the evidence for precognition.
Now, back to Dunne for a moment, though. If I recall correctly, what he was trying to do when he kept his dream journal was to analyze whether his dreams were influenced by past events, which would be the conventional interpretation, as opposed to future events. And I believe he concluded that the future events had just as strong, maybe even a stronger influence on his dreams than events from the past.
Yeah, he was a little inconsistent on that. I don't think he quite could tell what the proportion was. I think at one point he says that, maybe half and half. That's still an open question. And I think it's going to be an open question for a long time, because it's very hard, even if you had a bunch of psychologists or neuroscientists or whatever who were completely open to the idea of precognition, and would even accept that idea. It is very hard to scientifically study dream content in relation to life experiences. I mean, this is a challenge for the study of dreams, and it has been for a long time. And it's one of the reasons, arguably, why here we are, well over a century after Freud was, writing and so forth, and we still, you still read in the science news some new theory of why we dream. Like there's just no clue in mainstream psychology for the purpose and function of dreaming. There's a lot of dispute, and part of it's the problem of tying, relating somehow, if there is a way to relate them, dream content with actual lived experiences, whether those be past experiences that are being encoded in memory, or future experiences that are being encoded in a kind of memory, or some mix of both. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting, I guess, a working hypothesis that I am that I'm working with. I don't say this in the book because it's really just a hypothesis, but I'm sort of interested in the idea that maybe all dreams are basically precognition, and that it's just very hard to identify that. So I think that has to be a possibility we keep on the table, that this idea that they relate to the past is really a kind of an illusion, because in the course of our lives, we're always remembering, and we're always, dealing with our past in some way. So it would be very hard to tell the difference in a sense between precognition and something else. But figuring out that balance that's going to be a big question for a long time, I think.
Well, I gather from your book that the mainstream point of view in conventional neurology these days is that dream content is essentially random, that Freud's notion that dreams give us clues as to the unconscious has been pretty much rejected as unscientific, as kind of a form of psychological projection. Is that right?
Well, that was the story until, I don't know, I'd say until about 20 years ago. He'd been Freud had just been consigned to the dustbin because, his theory was unscientific, and it just, it rubbed, obviously Freud has rubbed many people the wrong way for a long time, and scientific psychologists and neuroscientists really didn't want to have anything to do with it. I think it's kind of, he's, I think, coming back into favor a little bit, because you have a growing consensus among mainstream dream scientists that dreams are not random and senseless, that they reflect memory consolidation, that they do reflect our events in our lives being kind of wired into our long-term memory. And this is really not that far from what Freud was arguing. I mean, you have to throw out a few of the throw out Freud's functional argument. I mean, he claimed that dreams were wish fulfillment. They were all the disguised fulfillments of repressed wishes. Well, get rid of that idea, and what's left is actually pretty close to what I think a lot of dream scientists would argue nowadays, which is that look, our memory works by association. I mean, our brain is this hyper-associative thing, and that's the way our memories work, are organized, is through chains of association. And that's exactly what Freud identified as his dream work, or sometimes called primary process thinking, which was that experiences and thoughts and feelings and so forth associate to each other, and thus a dream that's, about some powerful experience, it's not going to represent that experience, it's going to represent things that are associated with it in some way. The dream is going to reflect those associative neural pathways in our heads. And his method, his number one tool for interpreting a dream was free association. It's like he keyed in on the fact that if you take a dream, and it may seem absurd when you just write out the literal dream, but then the moment you take apart its elements, and you just, what's the first thing that comes to mind with that particular person, for instance, it's random person from my past, appears in a dream, and like, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Well, it's like there's an immediate usually association that's maybe absurd and silly, but it makes sense when you start to free associate on a dream, right? So he really did hit on, I think, the basic way that memory is organized in our heads, and so it's not really a big leap to what a lot of contemporary dream scientists are saying about dreams as being involved in memory consolidation and so on. And it's not a far leap from that if the memories that we're consolidating are actually also events in our future. It's not a big leap, really. So I make a big case in my book that we really need kind of a return to Freud, in a way, in the study of precognition, because really his theory of the unconscious, I think, was a theory of precognition, just without realizing what it was. For him, the unconscious was this buried reservoir of thoughts and feelings and so forth going on somehow below the surface, so that they were thoughts, but we weren't aware of having those thoughts. So there was always something really paradoxical about that. And that's one of the things that has rubbed scientists the wrong way about Freud all these years. Well, if we realize that, wait a minute, maybe those thoughts are things from our future, and that's what he was describing was the way we were being influenced by our future thoughts and feelings and experiences. It makes a whole new sense of what he wrote. And in fact, his writings are full of examples that when you look at them with this new perspective, oh my God, I mean, there's so many examples that make perfect sense of the unconscious as what I call consciousness displaced in time, or cognition displaced in time, if you prefer that term.
Some of Freud's most famous dreams that were the basis of his development of his psychoanalysis of dreams and dream interpretation were actually precognitive, and he himself either didn't recognize it or was subconsciously in denial and was trying to hide the obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a stunning case, really. The fact that his most famous dream, and in fact, the dream that put him on the map, we would probably not know about Sigmund Freud today had he not had a dream in 1895 while on vacation about one of his patients, looking in the mouth of one of his patients and seeing this particular sequence of, or this particular set of symptoms inside the mouth of this patient. And then some other things happen then in the dream, and then he interprets this in a kind of convoluted way. It's really not his most convincing dream interpretation, honestly, but he interprets it as having to do with certain professional anxieties he was feeling at the time. But boom, this was such an epiphany for him that this is how you can interpret a dream, and that dreams are the repressed, like I said, the repressed fulfillment of repressed wishes. Yeah. Let's see, I think it was 28 years later, he developed an oral cancer, which matched uncannily the symptoms in that patient's dream from nearly 3 decades earlier. And it's really stunning, in fact. And in fact, the woman in the dream, had a bunch of other symptoms, and those symptoms were also symptoms that he had experienced. So it made sense that this dream figure with his illness was being displaced onto this patient of his. And we could go, I could go in depth into this, but I mean, one of the interesting things about it is that his oral cancer was caused by smoking. And he was, even at the time he had the dream, he was sort of conflicted about his smoking. He had given it up on the advice of his best friend, Wilhelm Fliess, but he'd recently taken up smoking again, and he was worried about what his friend was going to think. He had a lot of anxiety about his health already, and anxiety about the impact of his smoking at that time. So it just almost seems like there was this resonance across time, of nearly 3 decades that sparked this dream.
Well, Freud thought, as I recall from your book, that this dream, he described it as sort of his Rosetta Stone, that it gave him the key to interpreting all dreams. But what you're saying is that unbeknownst to Freud, this dream actually was a prophetic dream about his own death.
Well, it was a prophetic dream about the illness that dominated his life in his last decade and a half. He actually didn't die. I mean, he actually wound up living another, I think, 16 years after the diagnosis and the surgeries that really, they transformed his life and really incredibly compromised his quality of life over that time. He wound up unable to speak, unable to open his mouth. I mean, and it was really, really awful what he endured as a result of it. But he did live a long time and argue. In fact, the cancer surgeon who first discovered this connection between his dream and his cancer, actually argued that it wasn't, he looked at the case files very closely, and he decided that it wasn't actually the cancer that killed him, that it was, results of the treatments that he received and the radiation treatments he was receiving and so forth. So, whether it caused his death or not, it was nevertheless this, enormously important upheaval in his later life, which filled his head with thoughts of death, certainly. But
that would be an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy or a time loop?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yes, well, it would, in the sense that here's the interesting thing, and this is what I'm working on right now. I could only sort of touch on this in the book, but the idea is that if information is refluxing into the past and influencing us in the past, in our dreams, for instance. It can't be, it can't be literal. Like if he had actually had a dream, if the dream were instead that he looked in the mirror and saw these symptoms in his mouth, he might have quit smoking, right? And in fact, I believe Carl Jung actually had a dream about his smoking that caused him to quit. Who knows where that dream came from or whatever. But the point is, the precognitive unconscious can't show you something with such clarity that you're then going to take a course of action that leads completely to you not, having that outcome. It's going to displace it in such a way that it's significant, but you can't quite tell how significant it is or in what way it's significant. So he wound up not, quitting smoking as a result of his dream. He thought the dream was, he didn't think it was about Irma, the woman in the dream, either. But he didn't make the connection that it was about his own physical health. I mean, he thought it was about his own mental health, right? And one of the interesting, aspects of this dream is that so he has a dream, it certainly can't serve as a warning to him not to smoke or whatever, so he goes ahead and gets cancer 28 years later. But, had he quit smoking, he would not have lived any longer than he did because of the Holocaust, right? But what this dream did do, and his misinterpretation of this dream.
Wait, hold on just a second, because Freud, as I recall, he died, in the 1950s?
No, 1939.
1939. But he, right. If I remember rightly, maybe I'm incorrect, he died in England.
That's right, and that's my point. Had he not misinterpreted the dream the way he did and become Sigmund Freud, the great psychiatrist who has decoded the unconscious and so forth, he would not have been able to relocate to England with the help of his international community, but the point is also his family. So he wound up, in a way, his misinterpretation of that dream actually resulted in his whole family being saved from the Holocaust, if you want to look at it that way. Now, I mean, we're delving into speculation and thinking about counterfactuals and so forth. But it's this case of Freud's dream about Irma's injection. I think there's so many layers to it that you can ponder.
Well, and that's the case with Freudian thought in general. There's so many layers. But in terms of warning dreams, now you cite a very famous case in which a woman had I think it was a dream that the chandelier was going to fall on the crib where her baby was sleeping, and so she got up in the middle of the night against her husband's objections and moved the crib, went back to bed, and then a few hours later or minutes later, I'm not sure exactly, the chandelier actually crashed and fell and would have killed the infant.
Right. Yeah. That's a case from Louisa Rhine in one of her books. She tells that story. Well, the argument I make in the book is that dreams are not, again, they're not about events, and they're about our thoughts. They're about our future thoughts in relation to often upsetting or traumatic events. And they're often thoughts, really, even though they often seem to be about disasters and death, they're often about our own survival of those events. Or in this case, the survival of her daughter or son, I forget which, who, the first thought you're going to have upon looking at that crashed chandelier is, oh my God, my baby could have been lying there, I would suggest, and obviously we can't prove that, so there's a bit of supposition going on here, but I would suggest that precognitive dream was about her thoughts, a couple hours into the future, upon, this, seeing the chandelier there, realizing the sort of uncanniness of the fact that she had dreamed about it and had taken action on its basis and so forth, that whole perplexing, and upsetting and exciting time loop aspect that is present in so many precognitive experiences.
There are, I'm sure, dozens and dozens of individual instances where people had a flash of insight, an intuition, a precognition that maybe saved their life.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories of people having a premonition of a car crash, and then suddenly coming to that situation and taking suddenly becoming aware of the situation and hitting the brakes or whatever and having a near miss. Again, I really strongly think that what we're precognizing or having premonitions of is our thoughts in relation to events, which are often catastrophic, even when the outcome is not catastrophic. But this gets into question. My position on this is a minority position. I think most people or many people who study precognition kind of retain the idea of the future as open-ended and subject to our choices, and so that what we're dreaming of or whatever is possible futures. Mm-hmm. And it's on analogy to the wave function in quantum physics. It's sort of the wave function is this open fan of possibilities, and then we actualize a certain possibility through our behavior. But I argue in the book that, and it's a kind of lengthy argument, but that really precognition makes more sense in a block universe, mm-hmm. where outcomes in a sense are fixed, and we're responding to those outcomes. But in fact, we're not seeing like a video quality representation of a future event. We're seeing our own future mm-hmm. thoughts and responses.
Yeah, the conventional way of thinking about it is that nobody can know the future because the future hasn't happened yet. Therefore, all we could possibly know are probabilities. But you're going back to sort of the Einstein-Minkowski view of a deterministic universe where every event from the Big Bang to the death of the universe itself is already kind of set in, not in stone. You use the image set in glass.
Yeah. So we can see inside it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also suggest that in addition to this idea of the block universe, well, within it there are signals being generated, what we might conventionally think of as from the future into the present, or from the past into the present. Yeah, well, the idea that's kind of taking shape, at least among some physicists, this is still a minority view, but it's growing. Just year by year, we're seeing more and more physicists kind of coming on board to this idea of some sort of retrocausal model. And what that means is not that there's sometimes some retrocausal influence, or that sometimes you have particles traveling backwards in time or anything like that. What it really means is that every particle in the universe is going to be a world line, right? And that you can look at a particle either as an object or as a set of information, a bundle of information. It's like, an electron has, certain properties that are measurable, and it has a spin and so forth. And each of these is a piece of information. Well, the idea is that every interaction between particles is, it's not only changing those interacting particles going forward in time, it's changing them going backwards, so that really the world as we experience it is a product of two directions of influence. Now, on a micro, quantum level, you're talking, the time difference between any given interaction is, minuscule fractions of a second, But the idea is that you can have certain circumstances which scale up this retrocausal effect, and that you could see this over longer periods of time. Mm-hmm. And one, I think, really interesting argument or hypothesis would be that, this might be the kind of missing X factor that distinguishes life from lifeless, inert matter that's simply
obeying the second law of thermodynamics, right? Because we've always had these, that somehow in the classical view of matter and energy, it's like things always lose energy, and so how do you get systems that bind energy and that seem to orient towards order? And so you've had various theories through the years. Vitalism was an important one in the 19th century, and then various other theories. There was a theory called syntropy in the middle of the last century, and it's been revived lately. You have Rupert Sheldrake with his morphic resonance idea. Well, the new thing in biology is quantum biology, right? I mean, we're just right at the infancy of learning how these quantum effects scale up in biological systems. Well, if retrocausation is really kind of underlying a lot of these quantum effects, like entanglement, then right there you might have an answer to what life is. Really, it's the ability to bind time, essentially, to orient towards survival, towards persistence, because that would be the sort of that's what I mean by time loops potentially being kind of the basis for everything. I mean, that might be. If I had to put my money on some theory for life's origins, I would really put it on that life is going to turn out to be systems that molecular systems that bind time and that thus persist in time because they're able to orient towards their future survival, to some degree higher than chance would predict.
Mm-hmm. Well, you point out that physicists have been holding conferences on retrocausality, and that there are some experiments now confirmed, I gather, that where a signal has been sent at least 1/1000th of a second into the past.
Yeah, this is being shown in experiments. Now, the problem with quantum physics is that you can interpret everything in so many different ways. So, like the retrocausal interpretation, like I said, it's growing in, I think, influence, and you have a lot of people sort of coming on board with this idea. And it's been there, it's been there since the beginning, but really people didn't bother to think about it. For one good reason they didn't bother to think of, there's multiple reasons actually. But one reason they didn't bother to think about it too much is because it was thought to be impossible to detect or to distinguish a retrocausal influence from an ordinary causal influence due to Heisenberg uncertainty. But there are new methods of what are called weak measurement seem to get around that, and that's where we're starting to see these what look like retrocausal effects. And the place where you're really going to see this, and we're already seeing evidence of this paradigm, is in quantum computing, because they're showing that in a quantum entangled system of a quantum computer circuit, you can have an indeterminate causal order in these computations. And what that suggests, again, is this idea that entanglement is really a retrocausal phenomenon, that it's not non-locality as it's typically framed, that it's something much more timeless in a sense. And that's, literally every month I read some new article about these developments in quantum computing that really are pointing to some kind of retrocausal model.
And you also point out that you get a similar idea from Einstein's theory of relativity, that somebody's future could be somebody else's past, according to relativity theory.
Well, one of the really exciting things about retrocausal or a retrocausal interpretation of quantum mechanics is that potentially you have a kind of reconciliation here, right, between the Einsteinian relativistic universe and the quantum universe. I mean, this has been one of the big rifts, obviously, in science and in physics for a long time, that they can't make they can't make quantum mechanics sort of mesh with relativistic physics.
Right.
Well, I'm not enough of a physicist to say exactly how this could work, but it really seems like retrocausation could open the door to a kind of new model that sort of reunites these two strands that have sort of been operating in tandem for so long.
Well, it does seem to me that whether you're talking about relativity or quantum physics, you have, I guess I'll call them paradoxes related to time itself. That time is probably the least understood element in all of physics.
Yeah, absolutely. And this does not, let me hasten to add that retrocausation, precognition, whatever, does not solve, these problems of what time is and how consciousness relates to time. I mean, these are big mysteries. But, it's a potentially new avenue for exploration that I think has just been blocked off for a long time. I'll name a couple of the other reasons why it's been blocked off. They're philosophical reasons, actually, and this is, to me, very interesting. I mean, my background is anthropology, really, and so I'm really interested in sort of how knowledge works and how people relate to knowledge and how people's kind of unconscious mental frames influence how science has progressed. And it's really funny that one of the big stumbling stones for thinking about retrocausation is this idea of free will, right? I mean, the moment you start talking about precognition or retrocausation, you people go, wait a minute, what does this do to my precious free will, right? To my sense of the future is open-ended and subject to my actions. Well, okay, let's bracket that problem. It's really interesting that I think even physicists feel that sense. I mean, they really should be worrying about stuff going on in their experiments and not thinking in terms of philosophical questions like free will. But we can't help it. As human beings, we cannot help, bring our own preferred sense of who we are and what we are as people to this problem. And so, boy, people just don't want to go there in thinking about any kind of backwards causation. And so that kind of acts as a force field, right? It sort of deflects us.
It seems to go against common sense in multiple ways.
Right. It goes against, but is it common sense for all humans, or is it common sense for us as Westerners who have we love to think of ourselves as individual agents, in control of our destiny and so forth. In fact, this was one of the reasons Freud refused to countenance any idea of premonitory dreams. He detected, he went back, his number one myth was Oedipus. Well, what's Oedipus about? It's about a guy trying to evade a prophecy, but actually fulfilling the prophecy by trying to evade it. It's about a time loop, right?
Yeah.
But he said, well, ignore that part, because the ancients, we're modern, we can't accept this idea of fate and so forth. Just focus on the incest part.
Now, maybe for the benefit of our viewers who don't know the Oedipus myth, you could just summarize it briefly.
Right. So, the story is that King Laius of Thebes receives a prophecy that his son is going to kill him and replace him on the throne, and so he tells his wife Jocasta to take your infant son and kill him somehow. And so of course Jocasta delegates it to a servant or whatever. She takes him to the wilderness and stakes the baby out to die. But of course the baby is rescued by another traveler who takes him to Corinth, and baby Oedipus is raised in Corinth by the king in Corinth, and then an oracle tells him he is going to kill his father and marry his mother, but he doesn't know that he's not he doesn't know he's really from Thebes. Okay, so he flees Corinth And at a crossroads, he meets this guy who gives him a hard time and kills him. And it turns out that guy was Laius, King Laius, and he doesn't realize that. But anyway, he winds up answering a Sphinx's riddle and becoming king of Thebes and marrying Queen Jocasta and having children and so forth. So he fulfills the prophecy precisely by trying to evade the prophecy. But for Freud, the significance of this myth was purely that we all have this powerful longing and attraction toward our opposite sex parent, and so it became the Oedipus complex and all that. But what's fascinating is this is a story of trying to evade a prophecy. It's about fate and prophecy and all that.
A classic time loop.
It's a classic time loop, exactly.
Freud himself, while he's denying the possibility of precognitive dreams, is actually using the Oedipus myth as his.
Yeah. It was only the ancients who believed in fate and that sort of thing, and that we're modern. We just can't accept that anymore. In other cultures, like Eastern cultures, there isn't this need for us to be masters of our destiny so much.
Yeah. They don't have the rugged individual archetype as strong in their culture as we seem to.
Right. But the point is, whether we have free will or not, what that even means, we need to, if we really want to understand reality, we should kind of set aside our preferences and just look at reality. And and the thing is, it's whether we have free will or not, what that even means. Even if I have free will or not, I still have to get up in the morning and put my pants on and eat breakfast. It's like it doesn't actually change anything. You can say it's like you can say we have free will or we don't have free will, and it doesn't actually affect anything. But it's just a stumbling stone for Westerners to wrap their heads around the idea of not having free will. But it's acted as a force field against thinking about retrocausation, precognition, and related things.
Your work is so detailed. I know we're just skimming the surface, but you've actually have very well elaborated arguments for every point along the way. So we've given our viewers a taste of your thinking about time loops. But what I'm really excited is that in the future we're going to have an opportunity to go into real detail about the physics, about the psychoanalysis, about the parapsychology and the case studies and the individual histories of people who have been involved in this. So I'm looking forward to many more discussions with you about these topics.
I would love that. Yeah, it's such a fascinating subject, and I think there's actually kind of a groundswell of people embracing these possibilities and talking about it. And I know you've had some of them on your show. There are a lot of good books coming out about this topic now. I think it's going to really it's going to change things, I think. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me just say, for the benefit of our viewers who may not have had a chance to open your book yet, Jeffrey Kripal, who has been a guest on this program a number of times, has written that he believes your book is the most significant book published in the field of parapsychology in the last half century. It's and I have to agree, it's right up there with the best books I've ever read in the field. And so I'm going to encourage our viewers to take a look at it, and I'm really excited about the prospect of the future interviews that we will have.
I'm equally excited. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for being with me. It's been a real pleasure.
It has.
3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.